This is The Reality. And a very special hello to you. As always, welcome to The Reality, a half-hour talk show talking about the sure reality of real life as found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Change lives, change lives. If your life has been touched and changed by the reality of Jesus, I'd love to hear from you. Please write me an email, dudley@surereality.net. Again, dudley@surereality.net. Christian worker Andrew Brunson was arrested in Turkey on alleged links with banned political groups. Andrew had lived in Turkey with his wife and family for the best part of 20 years, most of that time working for a church which had a congregation of about 24 people. He also faced up to 35 years in jail on charges of espionage, but the court convicted and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. In a Turkish prison, Andrew Brunson suffered a crisis of faith.
The reality is that I did not have a sense of strength, and what most surprised me was that I had no sense of God's presence. This ended up taking me from someone who was planting churches and preaching and teaching regularly into just a deep, deep crisis. So my first year was really a year of breaking. I think of the second year as being one of rebuilding. I came to a point where I said, whatever you do or don't do, God, I will still follow you.
In July 2018, he was released from prison for health reasons and moved to house arrest until his trial. Later, his release was negotiated by the US government. We talked with Andrew Brunson via Skype for today's The Reality. Well, it's my pleasure to speak to Andrew Brunson today on The Reality via Skype. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. We're going to be talking about your experience in Turkey, being in prison, being under house arrest. Your name hit the headlines a few months back, and indeed, I know there were many Christians around the world praying for your release. So, right off the cuff, will you tell us your story? How is it that you ended up under arrest in Turkey?
Well, my wife and I had been in Turkey for 23 years at the time. We were missionaries there. We'd been involved in church planting and reaching refugees as well. And one day we were called into the local police station. We thought we were going to pick up our long-term visas, and instead they told us there was an order to deport us and they were going to arrest us. So this was a surprise to us. We thought we were going to be there for the rest of our lives, and that's not how it worked out. As to why they arrested us, there are usually two answers to most of the questions that I'm asked. And one is the human story, which is, all the political intrigue and what the Turkish authorities thought was motivating them. And then there's the underlying God story, which is less visible. It's a lot more subtle, but it's a lot more fundamental and more real. And so why they arrested us, I think they were going to deport us. They didn't like what we were doing. And then somebody very high up decided to keep me. And I think they wanted to make an example of someone, to intimidate other missionaries so they would leave on their own, and also to intimidate local Christians, Turkish Christians and Turkish church leaders. And then over time, of course, it turned into they held me to try to get concessions from the U.S. government. The God story is that he was doing something much bigger than that, and that I think he was very involved. He didn't put me in prison, but he was very involved in my imprisonment and was using it for his purposes.
Absolutely. So may I ask, how long were you in prison in Turkey?
Yes, I was held for 2 years.
Okay.
Now, what I do mention is that if it had been 2 years, if I had known it was going to be 2 years, then I would count the days down, and it would be very difficult for me. But I would have a goal. But the Turkish government wanted to give me 3 life sentences, and so 3 life sentences, solitary confinement with no possibility of parole, plus 35 years on top of that. So this is the actual weight, that the uncertainty I was living with. Until the very day that I was released and allowed to leave the country, I did not know if I was going to be released.
My word. Man, it must have been an horrific experience. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of the politics, but just a question, why did they arrest you?
I think they were going to deport us. There was a friend of mine who had a similar profile, who'd started a church and was working with the Syrian refugees who'd come into Turkey, was deported right before us, and someone right after we were arrested. So I think that was the reason they wanted to get rid of us.
Yeah.
But then holding on to us, that was something they hadn't done before. Somebody ended up coining the phrase hostage diplomacy. And I was the test case for this.
Goodness me. So obviously there were political ramifications. They were accusing you of being involved in the coup, the attempted coup. Am I right?
Well, that was one thing. Also being a spy, supporting terror groups. Underlying it, though, was an animus toward Christians. So the Turkish government knew very well that all of the things they were saying about me were false. They kept changing the story, kept giving different reasons. Eventually, they did, officially charge me with helping to organize the coup attempt in 2016, being one of the organizers, and of the other things I mentioned, spying and terrorism.
Yeah.
But that was just, for public consumption.
Yeah.
They knew very well that wasn't true.
Yeah.
And when they put me on trial, one of the main things that they emphasized was Christianization. This person was involved in Christianizing people and basically presenting Christianity as a threat to Turkey.
But I believe, Turkey wants us to believe it's a secular state. How is it there is so much persecution there?
Well, it has its own form of secularism, but this has really changed over the last years. Under the current president, there's been a real Islamization campaign. And Turkey has turned from, now it was all Muslim before, so it was not very open, and there was an attempt to suppress the growth of the church in the past, but it has the country has turned much more Islamist in the last decade.
It's a biblical land, reading through the book of Acts. Paul, the apostle, ministered and planted many churches in that country. And so we get lots of Christians touring the nation. How do they reconcile this to their political viewpoint?
So it's not at all dangerous for Christians to go to Turkey and to do tourism there. It's a beautiful country, and just going to the old biblical sites is just very meaningful. I've gone many times. I live near Ephesus. The city we lived is Izmir, and that's just an hour away from Ephesus. And you're right, most of the New Testament was written for people living in what is Turkey now, or by people living there. And so much of New Testament history took place there. There isn't really a risk for Christians to go there. It's more the kind of work that we were doing. And we had an open, relatively high-profile ministry there because our church plants were all out in the open. The work we did with refugees was known by the government. And so that is where you get into more risk. And I think anybody who's involved in an open church plant in Turkey is going to have death threats, bomb threats. We had those over the years. I was attacked once by a gunman. But that's not the experience of most Christians. Right.
Well, Turkey is listed as number 25 on the Open Doors watch list, which is, pretty bad, really. So the average Christian, and I believe there's over 100,000 Christians still in Turkey. So is there much persecution taking place in the Christian communities in Turkey?
So if the number 100,000 is correct, most of that would be from historically Christian communities, minorities, of which there are very few left in Turkey now, like Greek Orthodox or Armenian. And when we talk about Turkish believers, those would be more around the number of 7,000 is what I think right now. Those are Turks who have left Islam and become followers of Jesus Christ. So the amount of persecution now, there is some, but it's not something I talk about a lot because it's going to get much more intense. It is not so right now. And so when it becomes worse, then I think will be the time to highlight it. At this point, there is some suppression, but it is not what it's going to be. With my case, one of the things that happened is that the Turkish government used media, because media is pretty much very closely tied to the present government, to mount a propaganda campaign against me. And what happened with this is that they ended up painting me as a terrorist, as someone who hates Turkey, who wants to divide Turkey, someone who's a traitor to the country. And what they were really doing was painting all believers with this brush. It was an opportunity for the media to just let their anti-Christian thoughts out into the open. And this has created an environment that is much more tense for believers.
And we need to pray. We need to pray earnestly for Christians across the world suffering persecution like this, indeed. So, Andrew, you were under house arrest. How did you eventually get set free?
I was under house arrest, but that was for the final 2 months. The previous 22 months, I was held in prisons. And the house arrest only came about after tremendous pressure was applied by the U.S. government. Sanctions were imposed on Turkey, and that tipped their economy over so that it crashed. The Economist magazine, British magazine, it wrote, Andrew Brunson may be the most expensive prisoner in the world. So at that point, after tremendous pressure, they still did not release me, but they put me under house arrest and held me for trial, because I was on trial at the time. And I think there were 20 or 30 police and military police around our apartment. And this was not also armored vehicles. This was not to keep me in. It was to protect me because they had made me such a hate figure. And, it was much better to be, for those last 2 months on house arrest, it was much better than being in a maximum security prison, which is where I had been held.
They say.
But there were protests in the street. People were smashing iPhones and protesting at McDonald's and burning dollar bills. And so it was actually a very tense time.
Wow. But if you don't mind me saying, you're a normal, bloke next door. You're just a normal man like me. So sitting in that house and watching this transpiring outside in the street and seeing what was going on the television, how did you feel, Andrew, that, this is all about you and what you're going through?
Well, by that time I had come to see that God was doing something unusual. Church historian has told me that there was an unprecedented prayer movement that grew up around me. Unprecedented prayer movement focused on one person. So in living memory, there hasn't been this amount of prayer around the world focused on one person. And we came to see that I felt that my assignment in Turkey, especially the last few years I was there, was to prepare for a harvest, for a move of God. And when I was first put into prison, I thought, have I done something wrong? Have I disqualified myself from the assignment God gave me? And then I came to see over time, as the prayer movement grew and millions of people around the world in many, many countries began to pray for me, that actually this was an assignment from God. He was using me as like a lightning rod to pull this prayer in. And all of this prayer, it was intended for me, but it was kind of pouring over into Turkey. And I think preparing the conditions for the move of God. So I came to see that my imprisonment was an assignment.
Now, I do believe, too, that in the court you declared, I love Jesus and I love Turkey. Do you still love Turkey?
Yes, I do. And actually the context for that is that I had just been declared guilty by the court. They had moved very quickly to convict me, and they had declared that I was guilty of supporting terror groups and had sentenced me to prison. And so that was a very low point. And that was actually the entirety of my defense, because the court did not allow me to present witnesses or to provide any exculpatory evidence, although we had this ready to present to them. And so it was clear they didn't want me to present a defense. So that was the entirety of my defense.
Wow.
That I'm an innocent man. I love Jesus. I love Turkey. That's all I have to say. And I do love Turkey. And, this isn't some romanticized, idealized love like people have for the food and the culture, although there are many things we appreciate about it. Obviously, we were there 25 years, but it was more love expressed in a commitment to see God's blessing come to them. And this is something that God put in our hearts, and we were able to declare that in court, declare it as we left the country and afterwards as well, that in spite of what we went through, we do love Turkey.
You are listening to The Reality, produced by Sure Reality, a listener-supported ministry. We value your prayers and support very much. You can help us touch millions of people with the reality of Christ by becoming a Vision Partner. Visit surereality.net and click on Become a Vision Partner. That is, become a Vision Partner at surereality.net. Listen again to The Reality on our podcasts at surereality.net. Very special hello if you've just joined us. This is The Reality half-hour talk show talking about the reality of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to know more, then please do visit our website, surereality.net. In fact, you can listen again to this radio program at the website, surereality.net. Today on The Reality, we're speaking with Andrew Brunson, who faced up to 35 years in prison in Turkey on trumped-up charges of espionage. He has shared how he and his family had been living in Turkey for the best part of 20 years, involved in refugee aid and church planting. It's become evident that the Turkish government is intent on developing a more fundamental Islamic regime in the country, and therefore was displeased with Andrew and the work of other Christians in the country. To make an example of Andrew, they trumped up false charges of espionage and sentenced him to prison. Thankfully, by God's grace and the intervention of his own government, Andrew's sentence was reduced. He ultimately ended up under house arrest shortly before his release. Listening to Andrew's story impressed upon me the words of Jesus. In Matthew 24, verse 19, he said, "And they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." But he also said in John 16, verse 33, "In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Andrew Brunson ultimately discovered the truth of this reality, though at the time he felt deserted. Let's find out more as we continue to speak with Andrew Brunson via Skype. Well, speaking to Andrew Brunson today on The Reality, finding out about his incredible experience under arrest in Turkey, false accusations, dare we say, against him, spending a few years in prison and eventually, by the grace of God, getting released. Now, just to go back to your time in Turkey, Andrew, tell me a little bit about your work before you were arrested.
Well, Turkey is the largest unevangelized country in the world. So most Turks have never met a Christian in their lives. Most cities don't have any church at all. And so that's a good place to focus on church planting. Mm-hmm. So that's what we did. We were involved in several church plants over the years. And then when the Syrian civil war heated up, many Syrians came into Turkey. And before that, they'd been pretty much unreachable in some ways. And now they were in Turkey. And we thought, here's an opportunity not only to show love to them in their time of great need, but also to present the gospel. And this is what especially attracted attention from the Turkish government, because most of the refugees who came into Turkey are Kurdish. And there is a Kurdish problem, you could say, in Turkey. And so this put us higher on their radar screen. I'm the first person, the first missionary who was imprisoned in Turkey in living memory. So it's not something that we had really counted the cost for. And one of the things that I think characterizes my time in prison is that I broke. I broke spiritually, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And I was really surprised because I had been, I think, a relatively tough missionary. As I mentioned before, there'd been death threats and bomb threats, and I'd been attacked by gunmen, and we had sort of factored in the cost of that. But prison, the conditions I was in, the thought that I may never get out, may just die in a Turkish prison, never be with my family again. I ended up breaking in prison the first year.
Wow. Sitting in that prison, Andrew, How were you relating to the Lord? Did you feel his presence? Was he ministering to you?
I think this is what underlying my breakdown was, a real disappointment in God. It took me into spiritual crisis because I had spent years pursuing his presence, focusing on developing intimacy with him, especially through presence. If someone had told me before I went to prison that this was going to happen, I would have had some fear, but I also would have had a sense of bravado. Okay, bring it on. I'm just going to really lean into God, and Paul did okay in prison. Others have, my heroes have as well, so it'll be okay. And the reality is that I did not have a sense of strength. I did not have a sense of joy. And I didn't really have a sense of grace. And this really surprised me because I had expected to have those things. And I did have grace as I look back, but it was an unfelt grace for the most part. And what most surprised me and really wounded my heart was that I had no sense of God's presence.
Okay.
It was like it was completely removed from me for those 2 years. I experienced the silence of God. And this took me into crisis. My heart was deeply wounded, and this led to even questioning God's existence and certainly accusing him of not being loving, faithful, good, or true. And so this ended up taking me from someone who was planting churches and preaching and teaching regularly into just a deep, deep crisis with God.
My word. And so how did you eventually come out of that?
Yeah, so my first year was really a year of breaking. And I think of the second year as being one of rebuilding. And I came to a point where I said, whatever you do or don't do, God, I will still follow you. And so it was giving up the conditions that I'd placed on God. If you don't give me your presence, I will still follow. If you don't give me your voice, I will still follow you. If you don't give me a sense of grace or strength, I will still follow. If you don't release me, I will still follow you. And it was fighting against the offense in my heart. And I'll tell you one thing that was a real turning point for me. That was the turning point where I'm saying, I'm losing my relationship with God. I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to press into him. Not because I feel like it, because my emotions are in turmoil, but because I need to do this. I must fight for my relationship with God. And so one very important step I took is I imagined a lockbox, and I opened it just in my mind, visualizing it, and I put into it my questions and doubts and my accusation against God. And then I securely locked it in my imagination. And I said, God, you and I are the only ones who can access this box. We're the only ones who can open it. If you want to open it and deal with my all of my doubts and questions, go ahead and do that anytime. But as for me, I make the decision with my will. I am not going to open this box. I will not give a place in my mind any longer to these doubts and accusations, to these questions. I don't need answers to have a relationship with you. And that broke the strangled hold of just that wounded heart, the accusations. And after that, it didn't change. I still had a year of prison ahead of me. God didn't give me a sense of his presence, but that began an upward trajectory where after that, when I had doubts and questions, I would send them to the box, say, I'm not going to ask these questions. I am just going to put my eyes on God. And this was a key. Again and again, I made the decision with my will. I choose to turn my eyes toward him rather than away.
Come on.
And sometimes in my weakness, I can maybe only turn 1 degree in his direction. But it's all the difference in the world to turn toward him rather than away, because that set me up. It positioned me for him to begin to rebuild me.
Jesus in Gethsemane, he felt rejected by God. He was sitting in an olive grove and he was crying out to the Father, and he knew exactly what was going to happen to him. In his natural humanity, he knew the scriptures, and the scriptures predicted his death. But in his spirituality, he knew the essence and the power and the the trauma of bearing the weight of the sin of the world upon himself on that cross. And he says in the scriptures that Jesus looked through the cross, scorned its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God in glory at the other side of the cross. And then it says we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, Andrew. Fix our eyes on Jesus, author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy before him endured the cross. And I hear that in your story. You were in a Gethsemane, so to speak, where God was silent. I don't believe God was speaking to Jesus in Gethsemane. He was crying out to God. And in his decision in the end to do the will of God was his decision, like you have experienced and expressed, was a decision you made to serve God and to trust in him to get you through. And he did. He got you through to the other side, didn't he?
You know, the Gethsemane scene was very comforting to me over time, because I saw what you just described in Jesus. He knows what's going to happen. He knows he's returning to the glory he had with the Father before the creation of the world, as he says in John 17. And yet he struggled. He still struggled.
He did.
And I thought, this is Jesus at his lowest point. Yet he struggled. And this made me think, Jesus really understands. If he struggled with all the advantages he had there of knowing what's happening and what the fruit would be from it, then he understands my weakness. You know, I talk about experiencing the silence of God for 2 years, and it was terrible, and yet I came out with a different intimacy with him, and I came out stronger than when I went in. I almost lost it. I came very close to failure, but he took my heart through that.
Amen.
And so, yes, he's a great leader.
Amen. This is why it says that we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author of our faith. And we've got to have faith that he will take us through that barrier. He is, Andrew, on the other side of the wall already. God the Father was on the other side of the cross that Jesus faced, and he looked through the cross and he saw himself on the other side of the cross. And when we face trials, and you faced a dreadful trial, I haven't faced anything like that, but I do face little difficulties in life. But I remember, and I need to remind myself, and you've reminded me of this, that Jesus is on the other side of that difficulty. And even though I might not feel it today, I've got to, as you said, put our trust in him, not for the outcome, but for his grace and his power and his strength. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today on The Reality. I pray God's blessing that you'd share this testimony and change many lives. We've been listening to the story of Andrew Brunson, an incredible man who was imprisoned in Turkey, well, simply for being a Christian and doing Christian work in that country. Indeed, it's a dreadful thing to think that we are persecuted for our faith. But the reality is, Jesus said, in this world we will have trouble. He said, in this world we will be ostracized. We will be attacked. And some will even believe they're doing God a favor by taking our lives. It's the reality of persecution. But Jesus is with us always. But whatever the dilemma, whatever the persecution, let's pray that we will be strong. And in Andrew's words, say, God, I will still follow you. If you like prayer, please drop me a note, dudley@surereality.net. Any questions? I'd love to answer those questions. Email me, dudley@surereality.net. This radio program is produced by Sure Reality, a listener-supported radio ministry. We deeply appreciate your support very much indeed. If you'd like to partner with us, please visit the website surereality.net and click on Become a Vision Partner. From me, Dudley Anderson, to you, as always, keep your eyes on Jesus.